They say that family is supposed to be your safest harbor. We are taught from a very young age that blood is thicker than water, that no matter how harsh the outside world gets, you can always retreat to the unconditional love of the people who raised you. But what do you do when the people who share your blood are the very ones trying to hold your head underwater? What do you do when your own parents and siblings look at you not with love, but with deep, unyielding contempt, simply because you refuse to play the role they assigned to you? My name is Zinnia. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. The explosion that would eventually tear my family's pristine legacy to absolute shreds happened on a freezing Thursday night. It was Thanksgiving, late November of 2025. The setting was my childhood home, a sprawling, classic colonial estate nestled deep in one of the most exclusive, old-money suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts. To anyone driving past our towering wrought iron gates, looking at the warm light spilling from the grand bay windows onto the freshly fallen snow, we looked like the ultimate American dream. We looked like a magazine cover. But inside those thick brick walls, the air was suffocating. It was thick with the scent of expensive roasted turkey, vintage sage stuffing, and the undeniable toxic stench of generational narcissism. I was 33 years old, and I was sitting quietly near the end of the massive mahogany dining table. I was wearing a simple, understated black cashmere turtleneck, intentionally trying to blend into the background. For my entire adult life, I had been the designated black sheep of the Bramwell family. I was the cautionary tale, the disappointment. At the head of the table sat my father, Roscoe. He was 65, a tall, imposing man with silver hair perfectly swept back and a voice that was accustomed to issuing unquestioned commands. My father measured human worth exclusively through the lens of net worth. If you weren't generating massive, visible wealth, you were invisible to him. To his right sat my mother, Althea. At 62, she was a terrifying force of New England passive aggressiveness. She spent her days aggressively maintaining her status at the local country club and organizing charity galas, wearing her perfectionism like a suit of armor. She was currently adjusting the heavy crystal wine glasses for the 4th time, her perfectly manicured fingers darting nervously over the pristine white linen tablecloth. "They should have been here by now, Roscoe," my mother fretted, glaring at the antique grandfather clock ticking softly in the hallway. "The roast is going to dry out. You know how Vance hates dry meat." She wasn't worried about me. She hadn't even looked my way since I walked through the front door an hour earlier. All of her anxious, desperate energy was entirely focused on the imminent arrival of her golden child and the man who had supposedly elevated our family to a whole new level of elite status. Right on cue, the heavy oak front doors swung open, letting in a sharp gust of freezing winter air. Loud, booming laughter echoed through the grand foyer. "Sorry we're late, folks." Traffic on the interstate was an absolute nightmare for anyone not driving a tank, a booming, overly confident voice announced. It was Vance Sterling, my 36-year-old brother-in-law. He strode into the dining room like a conquering Roman general returning from war. Vance was a commercial real estate developer. He was a tall, heavily cologned man who wore a custom Italian suit to a family Thanksgiving dinner, deliberately leaving the jacket unbuttoned to flash the silk lining. On his left wrist rested a massive, obscenely expensive Patek Philippe watch, which he made sure to check constantly so everyone in the room was forced to look at it. Clinging tightly to his arm was my older sister, Cressida. At 35, Cressida was the undisputed princess of the Bramwell family. She was a vice president at a high-end boutique art brokerage, a job that essentially required her to schmooze with billionaires and pretend to understand abstract paintings. She was wearing a stunning emerald green designer dress, her blonde hair blown out into perfect bouncing waves. "My darlings!" my mother cried out, practically shoving her chair back to rush over and embrace them. The sheer, unadulterated adoration in her eyes was blinding. "We were just about to start without you." Vance had a massive conference call with his overseas investors' mom, Cressida said loudly, making sure the entire room heard the excuse. She kissed our mother's cheek and shot a triumphant look toward my father. When you're managing a $50 million commercial portfolio, you don't really get to take holidays off. The market never sleeps. "That's exactly right," my father beamed, standing up to give Vance a firm, masculine handshake. The pride radiating from my father's face was something I hadn't seen directed at me in over a decade. "It takes absolute ruthlessness to build an empire, Vance. We're incredibly proud of what you're doing." "Appreciate that, Roscoe," Vance smirked, pulling out Cressida's chair for her before taking his own seat directly across from me. It took exactly 3 minutes for Cressida to finally acknowledge my existence. She picked up her crystal water goblet, took a delicate sip, and let her eyes slowly drag up and down my plain black turtleneck. Her lips curled into a perfectly practiced smile of absolute pity. "Zinnia," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "I didn't even see you sitting down there in the dark colors. How are you holding up? Still living in that tiny apartment over in the garment district?" "I'm doing well, Cressida," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level and completely stripped of emotion. "And yes, I'm still in the same apartment." Vance let out a loud, sudden chuckle, reaching for the bottle of vintage Bordeaux my father had opened. "You have to admire the stubbornness, honestly," Vance said, pouring himself a generous glass. "Most people would have given up by now. How long has it been, Zinnia? 5 years since you dropped out of your master's program to build that little truck tracking app of yours? How's that going? Did you finally get a local delivery guy to download it?" The entire table laughed. It wasn't a warm, familial laugh. It was a cruel, unified chorus of mockery. 5 years ago, when I was 28, I made the terrifying decision to walk away from an Ivy League master's program in data science. I had seen a massive, glaring inefficiency in how global supply chains operated, specifically in the commercial logistics sector. I knew I could build an artificial intelligence algorithmic platform that could predict routing failures and optimize freight loads with terrifying accuracy. But I needed time to write the code. I needed a year of absolute, uninterrupted focus. So I went to my parents. I presented them with a 50-page business plan and asked for a small $10,000 loan to rent server space and keep myself fed. My father had looked at my business plan, laughed directly in my face, and threw it into the fireplace. He told me I was a delusional failure. He told me that women in our family didn't build tech companies. They married well and maintained the family prestige. Because I had no money, I was forced to move into their unfinished freezing basement. For a grueling 10 months, I ate cheap ramen noodles, wore extra sweaters to stay warm, and coded for 18 hours a day. All while they walked heavily on the hardwood floors above me, constantly complaining to their friends on the phone about their directionless, embarrassing daughter. Eventually, I secured a tiny microgrant, moved into a cramped studio apartment, and built my company from the ground up entirely in the shadows. "It's not a truck tracking app, Vance," I said calmly, looking directly into his arrogant, mocking eyes. "It's an AI-driven logistics and supply chain optimization platform. We service mid to large-scale freight operations." My mother sighed heavily, aggressively slicing into her piece of turkey. "Oh, Zinnia, please don't start using those made-up Silicon Valley buzzwords at the dinner table. It's exhausting. We all know you're just trying to make it sound more important than it is." "It's just sad, really," Cressida chimed in, resting her chin on her manicured hand. "You're 33, Zin. You have absolutely no safety net, no husband, no real assets. You spend all day staring at a computer screen pretending to be some tech CEO. Do you know how embarrassing it is when my high net worth clients ask about my sister? I literally have to tell them you're doing freelance IT work so they don't pity us." "She needs to learn the value of real-world equity," Vance stated authoritatively, gesturing with his silver fork. He looked at my father, seamlessly slipping into his fake alpha male persona. "You see, Roscoe, the problem with this tech startup generation is that they don't understand tangible assets. They build imaginary code in the cloud. I build strip malls. I build massive commercial warehouses. I buy dirt. I pour concrete, and I lease it to corporate tenants for 20 years. That is real money. That is how you build a dynasty." "Exactly," my father agreed fervently, practically hanging on Vance's every word. "That's why I've always said, Vance, you have the true Bramwell spirit. You understand leverage. You understand how to use capital to conquer the market." "Speaking of leverage," Althea smiled warmly at her son-in-law. "How is the new commercial plaza development coming along? The one downtown? Cressida told us you were securing the final round of institutional backing this week." For a fraction of a second, so fast that anyone else at the table would have completely missed it, the arrogant smirk on Vance's face faltered. A tiny muscle in his jaw twitched, and he quickly took a massive gulp of his red wine to hide his mouth. It's going perfectly, Althea," Vance said, his voice just half an octave higher than it had been a moment ago. "We are just restructuring some of the mezzanine debt, standard commercial real estate maneuvering. You know how it is, Roscoe. You have to aggressively leverage your primary assets to maximize the tax deferments. We're playing chess while the retail investors are playing checkers. My father nodded sagely, completely buying the absolute word salad Vance had just spit out. Brilliant strategy. Keep the institutional lenders hungry. I sat there, quietly cutting a small piece of roasted potato, maintaining my absolute silence. They had absolutely no idea. They had no idea that while Vance was sitting here bragging about his imaginary concrete empire, my useless little trucking app had just spent the last 12 months quietly revolutionizing how freight was moved across the entire North American continent. My algorithm had become so relentlessly efficient, so terrifyingly profitable, that it had caught the attention of the largest global logistics and financial acquisition conglomerates in the world. For the last 3 months, I had been locked in brutal, highly classified negotiations under a strict, ironclad non-disclosure agreement. I couldn't tell a single soul. But exactly 4 hours before I arrived at the suffocating Thanksgiving dinner, I had sat in a sleek glass boardroom in Manhattan. Surrounded by my legal team, I had signed my name on the final acquisition paperwork. A massive multinational holding company had just purchased my software firm in a complete 100% all-cash buyout. The final valuation was exactly $180 million. The funds had already completely cleared. They were currently sitting in my private, heavily secured holding accounts. I was officially, undeniably, a 9-figure centimillionaire. To celebrate, before driving to Boston, I had walked into a private boutique on Fifth Avenue. I had purchased a breathtaking custom-made timepiece, a watch crafted from solid platinum and encircled by flawless step-cut diamonds. It cost more than Vance's prize Patek Philippe and my father's luxury sedan combined. Right now, that heavy, magnificent watch was strapped tightly to my left wrist, completely hidden beneath the long, dark sleeve of my cheap cashmere turtleneck. I let them talk. I let Cressida insult my apartment. I let my mother roll her eyes at my existence. I let my father praise a man who I knew for a fact was nothing but a hollow, desperate fraud. I sat in the shadows of their blinding arrogance, feeling the cold, grounding weight of the diamonds against my skin, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to burn their grand illusion entirely to the ground. The dinner progressed with the predictable, suffocating rhythm of a well-rehearsed stage play. My father, Roscoe, carved the massive roasted turkey with the aggressive precision of a surgeon, deliberately handing the finest, thickest cuts of white meat to Vance first, then to Cressida, and finally to my mother. When it was my turn, he casually slid a meager, dry piece of dark meat onto my plate without even making eye contact. It was a petty, calculated gesture, a physical manifestation of where I stood in the family hierarchy. I ate in silence, my fork scraping softly against the antique fine china. I listened as Vance dominated the conversation, loudly regaling my parents with heavily exaggerated stories about his supposed conquests in the commercial real estate market. He threw around words like zoning variances, anchor tenants, and capital expenditures, like they were weapons designed to intimidate everyone in the room. My mother hung on his every syllable, occasionally reaching over to pat his hand affectionately while Cressida preened beside him, glowing in the reflection of his manufactured glory. It was horrifying to watch, mostly because I knew how incredibly fragile it all was, but I wasn't quite ready to pull the pin on the grenade just yet. Then, the mood in the room subtly shifted. The lavish dessert course was approaching, and Vance suddenly leaned back heavily in his ornate dining chair. He unbuttoned his custom Italian suit jacket a fraction more, projecting the image of a benevolent king preparing to address his loyal subjects. "You know, Roscoe, Althea," Vance began, his voice taking on a thick, synthetic warmth. "Cressida and I were talking just the other night about how much you two do for this family. You are the absolute bedrock. You built the Bramwell legacy. You hosted this beautiful Thanksgiving. And frankly, we think it's time you were properly rewarded for decades of hard work and endless sacrifice." My mother practically melted into her chair, pressing a hand to her pearl necklace. "Oh, Vance, you don't have to say that. Seeing you and Cressida succeed is the only reward we could ever ask for." "No, I insist," Vance countered smoothly, holding up a manicured hand. "Cressida and I have been incredibly busy locking down this new multi-million-dollar commercial plaza. We've been working 90-hour weeks, but we realized that family time is the ultimate asset, so we took the liberty of arranging a little family getaway for next summer." Cressida clapped her hands together, her diamond rings catching the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. We are booking a private, fully staffed luxury yacht to cruise the Amalfi Coast in Italy for 2 weeks in July. Just the 4 of us. Me, Vance, Mom, and Dad. We're going to drink vintage champagne, dock in Positano, and completely unplug from the corporate world. Italy? A private yacht? My father's eyes widened, a genuine, booming laugh escaping his chest. Vance, my boy, that is absolutely extraordinary. That's the kind of high-level lifestyle we're talking about. It's going to be the trip of a lifetime. Vance nodded, his chest puffing out with supreme arrogance. I kept my eyes locked on my half-empty water goblet. Just the 4 of us. The exclusion was painfully deliberate, stated out loud to ensure I felt the maximum amount of sting. For years, they had taken family vacations and conveniently forgotten to tell me until the week before, or claimed the flights were just too expensive to add a 5th person. I was entirely used to being the ghost at the table, but Vance wasn't finished. The grand announcement was merely the setup for the psychological trap he had carefully laid. Without breaking eye contact with my father, Vance slowly reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit. He pulled out a thick, heavy stock envelope. He casually flicked his wrist and tossed it straight across the massive mahogany table. It sailed over the floral centerpieces and landed squarely on my dinner plate, the pristine white paper instantly soaking up the rich brown gravy pooling next to my mashed potatoes. I stared down at the ruined envelope. The entire dining room went deathly quiet. The soft classical music playing from the hidden speakers suddenly felt obnoxiously loud. "Go ahead, Zinnia," Vance said, his voice dropping its fake warmth, replaced entirely by a cold, predatory sneer. "Open it." I slowly wiped my hands on my linen napkin. I picked up the gravy-stained envelope, popped the seal, and pulled out the thick, folded document inside. It was an official, finalized invoice from a premier Mediterranean yacht chartering company based in Monaco. The total amount due, printed in bold black ink at the very bottom of the page, was exactly $35,000. I looked up. Vance was swirling his expensive red wine, a deeply condescending smirk plastered across his face. "I think it is time you finally stepped up and paid your fair share for once in your life, Zinnia," Vance stated, leaning forward and resting his elbows aggressively on the table. "Cressida and I are incredibly generous with our time, but we are funding the private flights and the luxury excursions. Since you have absolutely no husband, no children to provide for, and practically zero living expenses in that pathetic little apartment of yours, we all agreed you should cover the primary charter invoice." I felt a sudden, familiar spike of adrenaline hit my bloodstream, but I forced my facial muscles to remain completely passive. I looked from Vance to my older sister. Cressida was inspecting her perfect manicure, but a cruel, delighted little smile played on her lips. She was actively enjoying the ambush. "Consider it a delayed Thanksgiving present to the parents who put up with you," Vance continued, his tone dripping with sheer malice. "You have lived a remarkably selfish, isolated life. You threw away an expensive Ivy League education to play around on a computer. You spent nearly a year living in their basement entirely rent-free, eating their food and burning their electricity while you chased a pipe dream. You owe them for that year, Zinnia. It is finally time you learned how to give back and act like a productive member of the Bramwell family." The sheer audacity of his demand hung heavily in the air. $35,000. For a woman they believed was struggling to pay rent on a tiny garment district apartment, asking for that amount of money was not a request. It was a deliberate, calculated attempt at financial and emotional humiliation. It was designed to make me break down, to make me confess my poverty in front of them, to make me beg for their understanding. My mother, Althea, chimed in immediately, her voice rising to that shrill, judgmental pitch she reserved exclusively for me. "Vance is absolutely right, Zinnia. We didn't want to bring it up and ruin the holiday, but your lack of contribution to this family is frankly embarrassing. We fed you. We clothed you. We gave you everything, and you turned your back on us to build that fake trucking software. Paying for the yacht is the absolute least you could do to show an ounce of gratitude." "Let's do some very basic math," Cressida added, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "If you had actually paid rent for the 10 months you hid in Mom and Dad's basement at standard Boston market rates, you would have owed them at least $20,000. Add in utilities, groceries, and the sheer emotional exhaustion of dealing with your stubbornness, and $35,000 is actually a massive discount. You should be writing the check tonight." I sat perfectly still, absorbing the brutal, coordinated assault. They were a pack of wolves circling the weakest member of the herd, completely intoxicated by their own perceived power. I looked down at the gravy-stained invoice. I didn't feel the urge to cry. I didn't feel the desperate, suffocating anxiety that used to paralyze me during these family dinners in my 20s. I only felt a cold, calculated anticipation, because underneath the dark sleeve of my cashmere sweater, the diamonds on my custom platinum watch were pressing against my skin, a silent, heavy reminder of the $180 million currently resting in my private bank accounts. I reached out with one finger and slowly, deliberately, slid the ruined invoice back across the polished mahogany table until it rested directly in front of Vance's wine glass. I am not paying $35,000 for a luxury vacation that I am not even invited on, I said. My voice was completely steady, pitched low, and I refused to break eye contact with my brother-in-law. My money is my own, Vance. It is not funding your Mediterranean playground. The silence that followed was immediate and explosive. "Excuse me, young lady," my father, Roscoe, bellowed. He slammed his heavy silver carving fork down onto the table with such violent force that the crystal glasses rattled dangerously. His face flushed a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. "How dare you speak to your brother-in-law with such profound disrespect in my house?" "I am not being disrespectful, father," I replied, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "I am simply declining an utterly absurd demand. I am not financing their vacation. It is a ridiculous expectation." "It is not an expectation. It is a debt," my father roared, standing up from the head of the table. He towered over the dining room, a man who built his entire identity on demanding absolute submission from everyone around him. "I have sat here for the last hour, watching you eat the food I paid for, sitting in the house I bought, acting as if you are somehow above the very people who constantly elevate this family name. Vance and Cressida actually bring prestige to this table. They bring tangible, massive success. You bring nothing but stubborn defiance and an embarrassing lack of direction." He pointed a stiff, trembling finger directly at my face. "You want to talk about your money, Zinnia? What money? The pennies you scraped together from your failing little computer project? You sit there with this arrogant posture, acting like you are an independent, self-made woman, when you know damn well that the only reason you have any sense of security in this world is because of the safety net I built for you. You have walked through your entire miserable life, knowing that no matter how hard you fail, you have the Bramwell family fortune to fall back on." I kept my eyes locked on his, refusing to shrink back into my chair. The safety net he was referring to was the family trust fund. For my entire adult life, my parents had used their wealth as an invisible, choking leash. Every time I made a decision they disagreed with, they would vaguely threaten my inheritance. It was their ultimate tool of psychological warfare. But tonight, the vague threats were ending. My father planted his heavy hands firmly on the dining table and leaned toward my mother. He didn't take his furious eyes off me. "Althea!" he barked, his voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Go into my private study right now. Open the top drawer of my mahogany desk and bring me the black leather folio. We are not waiting until after the holidays to deal with this." My mother hesitated for a brief second, looking nervously between my father's enraged face and Vance's deeply satisfied smirk. "Roscoe, it's Thanksgiving," she murmured, playing the role of the reluctant peacemaker even though her eyes betrayed her absolute thrill at the unfolding drama. "Perhaps we should wait until—" "Fetch the folio, Althea," my father commanded, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. She immediately stood up, the heels of her designer shoes clicking rapidly against the hardwood floor as she hurried down the hallway toward his private home office. The dining room fell into an incredibly awkward, heavy tension. Cressida picked up her wineglass and took a slow sip, her eyes shining with malicious glee. She loved nothing more than watching our father publicly tear me down. Vance adjusted his custom suit jacket, completely failing to hide the victorious, predatory grin spreading across his face. He had orchestrated this exact scenario. He had wanted to push me until I snapped, just so he could watch my father bring down the hammer. A few moments later, my mother returned. She was clutching a thick, heavy black leather folder embossed with the gold logo of my father's elite wealth management firm. She walked back to her seat and slid the folder across the polished table until it lightly hit my father's coffee cup. My father picked up the folder. He slowly pulled his reading glasses from his pocket and deliberately placed them on the bridge of his nose. He opened the folder, flattening the crisp, thick legal documents against the table. This was meant to be a grand, theatrical performance. He wanted to humiliate me thoroughly, to break my spirit in front of Cressida and Vance, and to reinforce his absolute, unquestionable authority over my life. "I had my legal team draft this updated estate plan 2 weeks ago," my father announced, his voice taking on the stiff, formal tone he usually reserved for hostile corporate boardrooms. "I was planning to sign it after the new year, depending entirely on whether or not you could finally show some basic respect and integrate back into this family. But since you have made your total lack of loyalty painfully clear tonight, I think it is highly appropriate that we read the new terms together right now." He cleared his throat and began to read aloud from the heavy parchment paper, heavily emphasizing every single legal term. "Let the official record show that as of this current revision, the primary Bramwell Family Trust Fund, valued at approximately $5 million in combined real estate holdings, liquid market assets, and private equity shares, will be wholly and permanently restructured." He paused, looking over the rim of his glasses to ensure I was absorbing the sheer, crushing financial weight of his words. "In the event of my passing and the passing of my wife, Althea, the entirety of the estate will bypass our youngest daughter, Zinnia, entirely." He read loudly, his voice filled with cruel conviction. "She shall be completely struck from all inheritance claims, trust distributions, and power of attorney designations. She will receive nothing. Zero. The estate, including this primary residence, the summer home in Nantucket, and all secondary brokerage accounts, will be transferred in its entirety to our eldest daughter, Cressida, and her husband, Vance Sterling." Cressida let out a soft, theatrical sigh, resting her perfectly styled head against Vance's broad shoulder, as if she were deeply, emotionally burdened by this sudden, immense wealth. "Oh, Daddy," she whispered, her voice dripping with fake empathy. "You know Vance and I never asked for this. We only ever wanted what was best for the overall family." My father offered her a rare, genuinely warm smile. "I know, sweetheart," he said, his tone softening completely. "But you and Vance have proven yourselves. You understand how the real world works. You understand the profound value of protecting family capital." He turned his cold, unforgiving gaze back to me, the warmth vanishing instantly. "It is not just about punishing you for your insolence tonight, Zinnia," he added, his voice taking on a sickeningly practical, businesslike tone. "It is about strategic wealth management. We have a responsibility to ensure the family fortune is utilized effectively. Vance is currently in the process of securing the final institutional backing for his massive new commercial plaza. It is a highly exclusive, highly aggressive expansion. To secure the necessary 9-figure construction loans, he needs to show absolute liquidity and massive collateral to the banks." Vance sat up straighter, adjusting his silk tie. He cleared his throat, adopting the polished, authoritative voice he undoubtedly used to swindle investors. "Exactly, Roscoe," Vance said, nodding gravely. "We are moving into the big leagues. To satisfy the commercial underwriters, I need to show ironclad financial guarantees. The $5 million Bramwell estate will serve as the perfect secondary backing to build a multi-generational legacy. We are taking this family into the $100 million bracket, Zinnia, something you wouldn't understand with your little small business mindset." My mother practically beamed at him. "It is so incredibly exciting," she gushed, completely ignoring my presence. "You and Cressida are building an absolute empire. Your father and I are more than happy to pledge the estate to help you secure your new loans. It's what families do. We invest in each other's proven success." She then turned her gaze back to me, her expression instantly hardening into cold disappointment. "We tried to invest in you once, Zinnia, when you begged us for money for that computer nonsense, but you refused to listen to reason. Now you will just have to watch your sister and brother-in-law achieve greatness from the outside." Cressida couldn't contain her absolute delight. She turned her body entirely toward me, resting her chin on her hand, looking at me with a mixture of intense pity and overwhelming superiority. "You really brought this entirely on yourself, Zin," Cressida whispered, her words specifically designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. "I warned you years ago. I told you that throwing away your Ivy League degree to play around in a basement would leave you destitute. All you had to do was follow the rules. All you had to do was get a real corporate job and be a team player. If you had just done what Daddy asked, you would still have your little slice of the trust fund. But you had to be the rebellious dropout." She leaned slightly closer across the table. "The worst part is that you're not even a successful rebel. You're just a failure. And tonight you threw away your only safety net because you were too cheap and too bitter to pay for a simple family vacation. You overplayed your hand terribly, little sister. You have absolutely nothing left." Vance chuckled softly, wrapping his heavy arm around Cressida's shoulder, pulling her close. "Don't be too hard on her, babe," Vance said, his dark eyes locking onto mine with a sickeningly triumphant glare. Someone has to be the cautionary tale in the family. She can always go back to waiting tables if her little tech startup finally goes bankrupt next month. They all stared at me. The silence in the dining room was suffocating. They were waiting for the inevitable breakdown. They fully expected me to panic. They expected my hands to shake, my eyes to well up with tears. They expected me to start begging for forgiveness, desperately apologizing to Vance, and frantically offering to pay the $35,000 invoice just to save my financial future. The $5 million estate was their ultimate leverage. They thought holding it over my head would crush my spirit instantly. They thought they had permanently secured their wealth and successfully cast me out into the cold, brutal world with nothing but the clothes on my back. They had absolutely no idea how unimaginably small their little kingdom actually was. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I felt the cool platinum of my newly purchased watch resting against my wrist. I looked past my mother's fake, eager smile. I looked past Cressida's malicious glee and Vance's pathetic, manufactured arrogance. Finally, I locked eyes with my father, the man who was currently holding a pen over the document that would legally erase me from his life. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't offer a single word of apology. Instead, I let a soft, completely genuine smile spread across my face. It was a smile of absolute, unshakable peace. "Do as you wish, Father," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper, but steady enough to cut cleanly through the heavy silence of the dining room. "If you believe signing that paper is what's best for the family legacy, then by all means sign it. I don't need your money." The victorious smirks on their faces instantly froze. My absolute lack of panic didn't just confuse them. It deeply, profoundly infuriated them. But before my father could even open his mouth to scream at me again, Vance suddenly slammed his hands flat against the table, his fake alpha male composure cracking violently. Because he knew, just as well as I did, that the $5 million estate wasn't the real reason he had started this fight. It was time for his real agenda. My father's pen hovered rigidly over the heavy parchment of the revised trust document. His hand was actually shaking, not from sorrow, but from a profound, impotent rage. He had fired his absolute best weapon, the nuclear option he had held over my head since I was a teenager, and it had simply bounced off me like paper. Vance stared at me from across the table, his dark eyes narrowing into dangerous, calculating slits. The sophisticated, benevolent brother-in-law act completely melted away, leaving behind the raw, desperate predator underneath. He slowly reached across the pristine white tablecloth and pushed the gravy-stained yacht invoice out of the way, treating it like a discarded prop. "You really think you're untouchable, don't you, Zinnia?" Vance said, his voice dropping its fake, booming warmth and settling into a cold, hard growl. "You sit there in your cheap sweater, pretending you don't care about $5 million because you want to play the independent martyr, but we both know that's a lie. You're just being incredibly, stupidly stubborn." "I am simply refusing to be extorted," I replied, my voice completely devoid of defensive anger. "There is a significant difference." Cressida let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Extorted? Oh, please, stop acting like a victim. You owe us. You owe this family." "Actually, Cressida," Vance interrupted, holding up a hand to silence his wife. He didn't take his eyes off me. "Let's stop pretending this is about a family vacation to Italy. You're right, Zinnia. The $35,000 invoice was just a test. We needed to see if you would finally comply, if you would finally show some basic respect to the hierarchy of this family before we got down to actual business." My mother blinked, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Actual business? Vance, darling, what do you mean?" Vance ignored her. He leaned his heavy frame forward, resting his thick forearms on the mahogany wood. "You have exactly one tangible asset to your name that holds any real, immediate value in the commercial sector, Zinnia. The 15,000 square foot industrial warehouse in the South Boston Logistics District. The one your grandmother inexplicably left exclusively to you when she passed away 3 years ago." My heart hardened instantly at the mention of my grandmother, Eleanor. She was the only person in this entire family who had ever truly seen me for who I was. She knew exactly how my parents aggressively favored Cressida, how they constantly belittled my intelligence to make my sister shine brighter. So, when she updated her will in secret, she bypassed my parents entirely and left me a single, tangible piece of security. It was a prime piece of aging but unencumbered commercial real estate, completely fully paid off, with a crystal clear title. "That warehouse has a completely clear title," Vance continued, his eyes gleaming with a desperate, unhinged greed. I already had my real estate analysts appraise the lot. Because of the new zoning laws in the district, the land alone is worth at least $400,000 on the open market. But more importantly to me, I can use that clear title to instantly secure a high-interest commercial bridge loan by tomorrow morning. I looked at my parents. They were nodding slowly, as if Vance had just proposed a brilliant and entirely reasonable business transaction. They were literally sanctioning the outright theft of my only inheritance. You want me to sign over Grandmother Eleanor's warehouse? I asked, making sure I articulated the sheer absurdity of his demand out loud for the room to hear. I don't just want it, Zinnia. I demand it, Vance replied, his voice dripping with venom. I need secondary collateral to satisfy my institutional underwriters by the end of the week. Grandma Eleanor was clearly not in her right mind when she bypassed your parents to leave a prime commercial asset to a college dropout who builds fake software. We are simply correcting a terrible, emotional, legal mistake. My father slammed his hand on the table again, right on cue, to support the extortion. He is absolutely right, Zinnia. My father barked loudly. That property should have legally gone to your mother and me. We are the rightful heirs to the Bramwell estate. You have selfishly hoarded that building for 3 years, doing absolutely nothing with it, while your brother-in-law is out here desperately fighting to secure our family's financial dynasty. You are going to sign the deed over to Sterling Commercial Real Estate tonight. You are going to transfer the total ownership of that property directly to my holding company, Vance commanded, pointing his finger squarely at my face. It is the only way you can even begin to make amends for the profound disrespect you have shown your parents this evening. I looked at the four of them, acting like a unified tribunal of thieves standing right in the middle of a festively decorated dining room on Thanksgiving. The sheer audacity of his demand hung heavily in the air. I let a few seconds pass before I responded, just to watch Vance squirm slightly under the weight of his own desperate ultimatum. I am not transferring Grandmother's warehouse to you, Vance, I said, my voice remaining remarkably calm despite the absolute insanity of the situation. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever. That property is mine, and you have absolutely no right to lay a single finger on it. Vance slowly exhaled, a sharp hissing sound escaping through his perfectly white, veneered teeth. He slowly pushed his chair back, the wood scraping loudly against the floor, and stood up to his full height. He looked down at me, his dark eyes completely devoid of any remaining familial warmth. He was a cornered predator, and he was finally baring all of his teeth. Okay, Zinnia, he said, his voice dropping to a sinister, quiet whisper that carried across the silent room. Let's play it your way. Let's stop pretending this is about family loyalty and talk about brutal corporate consequences. He unbuttoned his suit jacket entirely, placing his hands on his hips, radiating a deeply toxic arrogance. You seem to think that because you hide in your little garment district apartment writing code, you are somehow insulated from the real world. That is a catastrophic miscalculation on your part. I manage portfolios for some of the most powerful institutional investors on the East Coast. I sit on advisory boards with the venture capitalists who fund the exact technology sector you are desperately trying to break into. I play golf with the men who dictate the entire software market. I kept my face completely neutral, but I maintained steady eye contact. I am well aware of who you play golf with, Vance, I replied simply. Then you should be well aware of exactly what I can do to you, Vance snapped, leaning down across the table so his face was entirely focused on mine. If you do not sign that property over to me tonight, I will personally make sure your little software company never sees another dime of revenue. I will make 3 simple phone calls tomorrow morning. I will casually mention to my network that your platform has critical security vulnerabilities. I will plant the seed that your coding infrastructure is highly unstable, that you stole the algorithmic base from your Ivy League professors, and that it is legally radioactive for any corporate entity to use. He smiled a cold, vicious smile. Rumors travel faster than light in the tech sector, Zinnia. By Monday morning, your platform will be entirely blacklisted across the entire logistics industry. No major freight firm will ever sign a contract with you. I will completely bankrupt the little app you spent 5 years of your miserable life building. I will crush it into dust just to teach you a lesson in power. Cressida stepped up beside her husband, her eyes shining with malicious glee. She loved seeing me threatened. She fed on it. He will do it, Zin, Cressida sneered, pointing a sharp, manicured fingernail at me. You know he will. You will lose your fake business, your apartment, and everything you have worked for. You will be out on the street carrying your laptop in a cardboard box, all because you were too stupid to just hand over an empty warehouse that you don't even use." My mother nodded, her expression completely devoid of any maternal empathy. "It is just the reality of the business world, Zinnia," she stated coldly, taking a sip of her water. "If you refuse to play ball with the big leagues, you get crushed. Vance is offering to take that land and use it productively. If you choose to be an enemy of his firm, then you fully deserve the professional destruction that comes with that choice." I sat there listening to my own family actively conspire to ruin my entire life simply to protect an arrogant commercial real estate developer. They were literally threatening to destroy my livelihood and to steal my inheritance to feed his ego. The level of sociopathic greed was breathtaking. Vance reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a crisp, pre-printed legal document. He tossed it onto the table in front of me. The bold letters at the top read, "Quitclaim deed, transfer of property." "You have exactly 5 minutes to make the smartest decision of your incredibly disappointing life, Zinnia," Vance demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the tense room. "I am not asking you anymore. I am telling you. You give me the deed to that South Boston property right now, or I will personally ensure that your entire career is violently dismantled by tomorrow afternoon. The choice is entirely yours." Just as he finished delivering his grand, terrifying ultimatum, the sharp, melodic chime of the front doorbell suddenly rang out through the sprawling house, echoing down the long marble hallway. The sudden noise broke the suffocating tension in the dining room for a fraction of a second. My mother jumped slightly in her chair, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. "Who on earth could be ringing the bell at this hour on Thanksgiving?" she asked, looking nervously toward the grand foyer. Vance didn't look surprised at all. In fact, his cruel smile widened, stretching across his face like a satisfied predator who had perfectly cornered his prey. "Right on time," Vance announced, checking his heavy Patek Philippe watch one more time. "I told you I don't make idle threats, Zinnia. I came to dinner completely prepared for your typical stubborn behavior." My father leaned back in his leather chair, folding his arms across his chest with a look of profound approval. He looked at his son-in-law as if Vance were a brilliant military general executing a flawless tactical maneuver. "You called a notary?" my father asked, his voice thick with admiration. "Of course I did, Roscoe," Vance replied, smoothing down his silk tie. "I arranged for a private mobile notary to arrive at exactly 8 o'clock tonight. I knew Zinnia would try to fight us on the land transfer. I knew she would try to delay and play games, but we don't have time for games. The institutional lenders open their doors tomorrow morning for Black Friday trading, and I intend to have the fully executed deed to that commercial property sitting on my desk by 9 a.m. Cressida clapped her hands together, a sharp staccato sound of pure delight. "Oh, that is absolutely brilliant, babe," she cooed, looking at her husband with sickening adoration. "You always think 3 steps ahead of everyone else." She turned her vicious gaze back to me, pointing to the blank signature line on the quitclaim deed. "Get your pen out, little sister. It's time to sign your life away and finally do something useful for this family." I listened to the heavy footsteps of our housekeeper walking down the marble hallway to open the grand double doors. A rush of freezing winter air swept through the house, momentarily chilling the warm dining room. Low, murmuring voices echoed from the entryway. The psychological pressure in the room was intentionally designed to be absolutely crushing. They had cornered me in my childhood home, surrounded me with hostile faces, and brought a legal official directly to the dinner table to force my hand. It was an ambush of the highest order. For any normal person, the sheer weight of their collective intimidation, the threat of losing their business and their family all at once, would have been enough to break them entirely. My parents were staring at me with cold expectation. Cressida was practically vibrating with malicious excitement. Vance stood tall and imposing, radiating the arrogant authority of a man who believed he held my entire future in the palm of his hand. Footsteps approached the dining room archway. A moment later, a man stepped into the warm light of the crystal chandeliers. He was a tall, impeccably groomed man who looked to be in his late 50s. He wore a razor-sharp, custom-tailored charcoal gray suit that spoke of immense expense and quiet, terrifying authority. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his posture was immaculate. In his right hand, he carried a thick, sleek leather briefcase. He did not look like a standard neighborhood mobile notary who stamped paperwork for $50 on a holiday. He looked like a high-powered corporate litigator accustomed to commanding boardrooms and dismantling multinational corporations. Vance immediately stepped forward, projecting his chest out to assert his dominance over the room. Ah, perfect timing, Vance boomed, extending a hand toward the dining table. Come right in. We have the property transfer documents ready to be legally verified and signed. My sister-in-law here was just about to finalize the deed to a commercial warehouse. The man in the charcoal suit paused at the edge of the room. He did not immediately walk over to Vance. He did not extend his hand to shake. His sharp, calculating eyes scanned the faces around the table, taking in the aggressive posture of my father, the smug expression of my sister, and the deeply uncomfortable tension hanging heavy in the air. My mother gestured to an empty chair next to me. Please, sit down, sir, my mother offered, adopting her sweetest, most fake country club hostess voice. We apologize for pulling you out on Thanksgiving, but this is an incredibly urgent family financial matter. We will make sure you are generously compensated for your time tonight. Vance tapped the mahogany table impatiently. Let's get straight to it, he commanded, looking at the man as if he were the hired help. Take out your stamp and your logbook. I want her signature witnessed and notarized right this second. If she refuses to sign, I want you to officially document her refusal so my legal team can begin drafting the corporate lawsuit against her software company first thing in the morning. They had built a perfect, inescapable trap. They had the motive, the means, and the muscle right there in the room. They were so blinded by their own arrogant momentum that they never even bothered to ask the man standing in the doorway for his name. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly in my lap, simply watching them celebrate a victory they had not actually won. Vance grabbed a heavy gold-plated pen from his pocket and slammed it down on top of the quitclaim deed. Sign it, Zinnia. Now. I slowly lifted my head. I looked past my mother's fake, eager smile. I looked past my father's stern, arrogant glare. I looked completely past Vance and his worthless, threatening document. I directed my gaze entirely toward the dining room doorway, where the sharp-dressed man in the tailored charcoal gray suit was still standing in perfect, absolute silence. He had patiently listened to Vance openly extort me. He had listened to my family threaten to destroy my livelihood. He had witnessed the entire breathtaking display of their undeniable, toxic greed. Vance noticed my sudden shift in focus. He frowned, his thick eyebrows drawing together in sharp, sudden irritation. What are you looking at, Zinnia? Vance snapped, his voice cracking like a heavy whip. Stop stalling and sign the documents right now. The notary has other appointments tonight, and we are not paying him to stand around and watch you pout all evening. I smiled. It was a completely genuine, deeply relaxed smile for the absolute first time that entire evening. I ignored Vance, who was glaring at me, and my father, who was practically vibrating with rage. I turned my body entirely toward the doorway, acknowledging the sharp-dressed man for the first time since he had stepped into the house. Good evening, Attorney Harrison, I said, my voice projecting a calm, authoritative professionalism that my family had never heard from me before. I sincerely apologize for making you work on Thanksgiving, but as you can see, the situation here required immediate and precise legal intervention. The man in the charcoal suit offered a brief, highly respectful nod. He took a few measured steps into the dining room. He did not look at my parents. He did not look at Vance. He kept his attention entirely fixed on me, treating me with the absolute deference a senior managing partner reserves only for his most powerful premium corporate clients. It is not a problem at all, Zinnia, Attorney Harrison replied, his deep voice carrying absolute legal authority. He placed his sleek leather briefcase gently on the edge of the mahogany table. I have all the finalized files right here, exactly as you requested. My father let out a loud, confused scoff. Zinnia, what on earth are you talking about? My father demanded, his authoritarian facade slipping slightly as genuine bewilderment crept into his voice. Who is this man? If he is not the mobile notary that Vance hired, then why did you invite a stranger into my home on Thanksgiving without my explicit permission? Vance stared at Harrison, his jaw dropping slightly as the gears in his head frantically tried to process the shift in the room's dynamic. I didn't answer my father. For the first time in my entire 33 years of life, I simply allowed his demanding voice to fade into the background like meaningless white noise. The trap had been completely dismantled. It was my turn to play. I slowly raised my left arm, resting my elbow on the polished mahogany table, and deliberately pushed back the long, dark sleeve of my cheap cashmere turtleneck. As the soft fabric slipped back, the bright light from the crystal dining room chandeliers caught the pristine, polished platinum and the glittering, flawless diamonds circling my wrist. It wasn't a subtle piece of jewelry. It was a custom-crafted masterpiece, an incredibly rare timepiece that commanded a price tag well into the six figures. I had kept it carefully hidden under my sleeve all evening, waiting for this exact specific moment. Cressida, sitting directly across from me, stopped mid-sip. Her wineglass hovered inches from her mouth. She was a luxury art broker who prided herself on knowing the exact cost of every designer item in existence. She knew instantly that the watch on my wrist was authentic, and she knew the astronomical wealth required to purchase it. Her jaw physically dropped. A sudden, sickening wave of pure jealousy and profound confusion washed over her perfectly contoured face. "Zinnia?" Cressida whispered, her voice trembling slightly, completely forgetting the hostility from just a moment prior. "Where did you get that watch? That is a solid platinum diamond set piece. You can't possibly afford that. You can't even afford to pay your rent without struggling. Did you steal it?" I completely ignored my sister's frantic, insulting questions. I didn't even look at her. I kept my eyes fixed on the diamonds tracing the edge of the watch face. I watched the second hand tick forward in smooth, precise, continuous sweeping motions. I waited until the tiny hand perfectly aligned with the 12. "Attorney Harrison," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady and clear, addressing the imposing man still standing at the edge of the dining room. "It is exactly 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Can you please officially confirm the current status of the legal blackout period regarding the corporate acquisition?" Attorney Harrison reached down and popped the heavy brass latches on his sleek leather briefcase. The loud dual click echoed sharply in the quiet room. He pulled out a thick stack of heavy legal documents bound in a black folder and placed them gently on the table. "I can officially confirm the status, Zinnia," Attorney Harrison stated, his deep voice carrying absolute, undeniable legal authority. "As of this exact minute, the 90-day non-disclosure agreement you signed with the acquiring board has officially expired. The blackout period is entirely lifted. You are now legally free to fully disclose the exact terms, the specific financial figures, and the total final outcome of the transaction to any private or public party of your choosing." Vance let out a loud, mocking laugh, desperately trying to shatter the serious, terrifying tension that was rapidly building in the room. He shook his head, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms defensively over his custom Italian suit. "A non-disclosure agreement?" Vance chuckled loudly, his tone dripping with forced condescension. "Oh, this is truly hilarious. You hired a fake lawyer to come to the house on Thanksgiving and play make-believe corporate executive with you? What exactly are you disclosing, Zinnia? Did your little trucking app finally sell a few $100 worth of basic routing code to a local delivery guy?" I didn't even blink at his pathetic attempt to diminish me. Attorney Harrison didn't flinch either. He simply reached into his thick leather folder and withdrew a crisp single sheet of heavy legal paper. He slid it directly across the table toward me, completely ignoring Vance and his obnoxious, nervous laughter. Vance stopped chuckling. His dark eyes darted between the severe corporate attorney and the document resting in front of me. The forced amusement on his face began to fracture, revealing the raw, panicked uncertainty underneath. His jaw clenched tightly. "What is this?" my father demanded, his voice losing its booming confidence and pitching up nervously. "Are you actually trying to pull some sort of elaborate prank on us right now, Zinnia? Because if you are, it is not funny. It is just sad." I placed my hand flat over the legal document. "It is not a prank, Father," I said softly. "It is the end of the illusion." I stood up slowly from my dining chair. For the first time all evening, I was not the quiet, disappointing daughter absorbing their abuse. I was the chief executive officer of a highly lucrative technology firm, and I was taking complete, unapologetic control of the room. I turned my attention away from the dining table and walked slowly toward the open archway connecting the dining area to my parents' sprawling living room. Above the massive stone fireplace hung my father's pride and joy, an 80-inch, ultra-high-definition flat-screen television. It was currently playing a continuous loop of a crackling Yule log accompanied by soft, instrumental holiday music. I picked up the sleek silver remote control resting on the glass coffee table and pressed the input button. The artificial fire vanished instantly, replaced by a stark black screen. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and activated the screencasting feature. A loud digital chime echoed through the integrated surround sound speakers as my phone synced directly to the massive television. "What are you doing now, Zinnia?" My mother asked, her voice completely devoid of its earlier shrill judgment. She sounded old and entirely out of her depth. "I am finishing the disclosure, Mother," I replied, my eyes fixed on the bright screen. Attorney Harrison said I was officially clear to share the details of my acquisition as of 8 p.m. I think it is only fair that my family gets to see the official announcement at the exact same time the rest of the financial world does. I opened my web browser and tapped on a bookmarked link. The massive television screen instantly illuminated the dark living room with the crisp white background of the official Wall Street Journal website. The page loaded completely, and the bold black headline dominated the entire 80-inch display. Global logistics conglomerate acquires AI supply chain startup for $180 million in all-cash deal. Just beneath the massive headline was a high-resolution professional photograph. It was a picture of me, standing confidently in front of a sleek corporate skyline. I was wearing a sharp, tailored designer suit, my posture immaculate, and my expression radiating absolute, unshakable power. I did not look like the pathetic basement coder they had spent the entire evening viciously mocking. I looked exactly like what I was, the newly minted creator of a massively successful financial technology empire. My mother let out a loud, ragged gasp, holding both hands against her cheeks. She stumbled backwards slightly, her expensive designer heels catching on the thick Persian rug. 180 million, she whispered, the massive number barely escaping her trembling lips. That is impossible. That cannot possibly be real. Cressida pushed her chair back violently and marched toward the living room, her eyes wide with frantic, terrified denial. No, she practically screamed, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at the television screen. This is a fake website. You created a fake website to trick us. A global conglomerate would never pay that kind of money for a stupid truck app built by a college dropout. It is a scam. Attorney Harrison stepped neatly into the living room, standing right beside me with perfect, unyielding posture. I assure you it is completely authentic, Cressida, Attorney Harrison stated, his deep voice cutting effortlessly through her hysterical denial. The funds were completely verified and transferred directly into my client's private holding accounts late this afternoon. It was an all-cash transaction. The money is entirely liquid and fully accessible. Your sister is currently one of the wealthiest self-made women in the state of Massachusetts. My father slowly walked into the living room, his eyes completely glued to the massive television screen. He read the headline over and over again, his lips moving silently as he processed the sheer, astronomical scale of my success. His entire life, Roscoe Bramwell had measured human worth strictly by financial power. He had worshipped Vance because he believed Vance was the ultimate symbol of commercial wealth. Now he was staring directly at undeniable proof that the daughter he had aggressively tried to disinherit was suddenly wealthier than anyone he had ever met in his entire life. Earlier this evening, my father had proudly brandished his $5 million estate like it was the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. He had dangled the family trust fund over my head, fully expecting me to beg and scrape for a tiny fraction of his wealth. But $5 million was absolutely nothing now. It was pocket change. It was a minor rounding error in my corporate ledger. I could buy his sprawling Boston estate in cash right this very second and barely notice the deduction from my checking account. I could buy the boutique art brokerage firm where Cressida worked just to immediately fire her. The money they had used to control me my entire life was completely, utterly meaningless. 180 million, my father muttered, his voice hollow and completely defeated. In cash. That is correct, father, I said, turning to face him. While you were busy worshiping a man who lies about his real estate empire, I was actually building something real. You told me I was a bad investment. You told me I had no drive and no future. You were so blinded by your own arrogant favoritism that you completely missed the fact that I became the most successful person this family has ever produced. I turned my attention back to the dining room. Vance had not moved from his chair. He was still sitting there, staring at the television screen, looking like a broken man. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, ashen gray. He knew exactly what that Wall Street Journal article meant. It meant that his threats to blacklist my company were entirely toothless. I didn't need clients anymore. I had already cashed out. It meant that I possessed more than enough liquid capital to completely absorb his pathetic threats without even making a dent in my personal net worth. He had tried to extort a woman who could buy his entire firm 10 times over. But I wasn't finished. I wasn't just going to show them my success. I was going to surgically dismantle his lies. I walked slowly back into the dining room and stood directly across the table from Vance. I picked up the quitclaim deed he had ordered me to sign, the document that would have stolen my grandmother's warehouse to feed his ego. So, Vance, I said, my voice echoing cleanly in the dead silence of the dining room. You told my parents you were securing the final round of institutional backing for a massive new commercial plaza. You told them you needed my property as a minor secondary collateral to build a multi-generational legacy. Vance swallowed hard. A thick bead of sweat rolled down the side of his face, soaking into the collar of his expensive dress shirt. He tried to puff out his chest again, but his broad shoulders were physically sagging. He looked exactly like a man standing on a trapdoor, waiting for the heavy lever to be pulled. You didn't just sell your company, Zinnia, Vance stammered, his voice cracking horribly. What do you care about a stupid warehouse now? You have $180 million. Just sign the deed and let us keep the family peace. I don't care about the warehouse, Vance, I replied coldly. I care about the fact that you are a pathological liar. I turned to Attorney Harrison and nodded. Harrison reached into his leather briefcase one more time and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of financial dossiers heavily stamped with red confidential ink. He placed them on the table directly in front of my father. What is this? My father asked, staring at the files but refusing to touch them as if they were radioactive. I am talking about the fact that my software doesn't just track trucks, Father, I said, looking right into Roscoe's terrified eyes. It actively monitors and predicts the economic viability of commercial shipping routes and the warehouses that service them. When my acquiring institution was conducting their final due diligence, they utilized my AI algorithm to run a massive stress test on the commercial real estate market. I pointed a sharp finger directly at Vance. My software identified a massive block of highly distressed commercial debt. It was a portfolio of incredibly toxic, empty strip malls and abandoned commercial plazas that a specific, reckless real estate developer was desperately trying to hide from his investors before he faced total, catastrophic liquidation. Cressida grabbed the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning bone white. Vance, she whispered, looking at her husband with wide, panicked eyes. What is she talking about? Vance opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. The smug, arrogant smile he had worn all evening had completely vanished. I'll translate it into very simple terms for you, Cressida, I said, my words striking like physical blows. Vance isn't building a new commercial plaza downtown. He hasn't broken ground on a new project in 3 years. His existing properties are bleeding cash, his anchor tenants have all abandoned their leases, and he is currently defaulting on multiple high-interest mezzanine loans. My mother looked back and forth between Vance and me, her brow deeply furrowed in complete horror. Defaulting? What does that mean for his business? It means his empire is an absolute fraud, Mother, I stated, the undeniable truth ringing through the room. He is entirely bankrupt. The only reason he hasn't been investigated and locked out of his own offices yet is because he promised his primary lenders he could secure fresh, unencumbered collateral to buy them a few more weeks. I looked down at the quitclaim deed in my hand. He didn't want grandmother's warehouse to build a legacy. He needed my $400,000 property to desperately plug a massive, gaping hole in his sinking ship. He wanted to use my inheritance to secure a predatory bridge loan just to keep his lights on through the holidays. He is using this family as his personal life raft. Vance stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He let out a nervous, grating laugh that completely lacked its usual booming confidence. This is exactly why lay people should never try to interpret complex commercial real estate data, Vance stammered, pulling a silk handkerchief from his pocket and quickly dabbing the sudden sweat from his forehead. Roscoe, Althea, please do not listen to this absolute nonsense. She is deliberately misinterpreting standard operational volatility. I am not bankrupt. I watched him scramble. He was desperately throwing Wall Street buzzwords at the wall, hoping the sheer complexity of the terms would intimidate my parents back into submission. It is not a sinking ship, Vance insisted, his voice growing louder and more frantic as he paced slightly behind his chair. What Zinnia is maliciously misrepresenting as toxic debt is actually a highly calculated asymmetrical risk curve. Yes, there is a temporary liquidity issue due to a cyclical market downturn. That is completely normal in aggressive commercial expansion. The lenders are fully aware of the macroeconomic environment. They just require updated collateral to satisfy internal compliance metrics while the market naturally corrects itself. The pledge of your warehouse, Zinnia, is nothing more than a temporary bureaucratic formality. I shook my head in absolute disgust. A temporary bureaucratic formality? Vance, you are facing catastrophic margin calls that you cannot meet. The moment their lawyers attach a lien to your holding company, the banks will foreclose on every single property you own." "Enough!" my father roared, his voice cutting through the dining room like a whip. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me. His face was flushed dark red with a desperate, pathetic denial. "I will not sit here and allow you to slander this man in my own dining room, Zinnia. Do you understand me? I have spent 30 years in the corporate world. I know exactly how high-level finance operates. Markets fluctuate. That is the fundamental nature of the beast." My father deliberately turned his gaze away from the heavily documented financial dossiers resting right in front of him. It was a fascinating, terrifying display of sheer psychological denial. To admit that Vance was a complete fraud meant admitting that his entire worldview was completely flawed. It meant acknowledging that the golden son-in-law he worshipped was a con artist. And worse, it meant that the daughter he openly despised was actually the only one telling the truth. His massive ego simply could not allow that reality to exist. Roscoe walked around the table and placed a heavy, reassuring hand on Vance's shoulder. "It takes absolute bravery to navigate a tough market, Vance," my father said, his voice thick with misguided, desperate pride. "Any amateur can make money during a bull run. It takes a real visionary to hold the line and execute a strategic reallocation during a downturn. We understand exactly what you are doing, and our faith in you remains completely unshaken." Cressida finally found her voice. She stepped up to stand closely beside her husband, linking her arm tightly through his, projecting a united, wealthy front. "Mom, Dad, think about what's actually happening here," Cressida said, her voice dripping with venom. "Zinnia is actively trying to sabotage our relationship. She is furious that you just cut her out of the trust fund. She probably manipulated those financial spreadsheets herself. She's a computer programmer, after all. Creating fake documents to scare you is exactly the kind of pathetic, desperate move she would make to try and desperately get her inheritance back," my mother gasped, pressing a manicured hand to her chest. "Of course," Althea whispered, the twisted narrative suddenly making perfect, comfortable sense to her deeply prejudiced mind. "She fabricated the data. You are entirely right, Cressida. It is completely malicious." Vance let out a long, heavy exhale, the color slowly returning to his cheeks. He stood up, much taller, the arrogant smirk creeping right back onto his face. He actually believed he had survived the ambush. He believed his silver tongue had successfully brainwashed my parents once again. "Thank you, Roscoe," Vance said, his voice dripping with fake humility. "I appreciate your sophisticated understanding of a highly complex situation. It is incredibly exhausting dealing with uneducated people who panic at the first sign of advanced market data." They turned to look at me, their eyes filled with an icy, resolute hatred. The delusion was absolute. They had collectively decided to strap themselves to the mast of Vance's rapidly sinking ship, simply because they greatly preferred his prestigious lies over my ugly, undeniable truth. I looked at the four of them, united in their toxic manufactured reality. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel sad. I only felt a cold, calculated anticipation, because I had one final card left to play, and it was going to burn their entire world to ash. I looked down at the quitclaim deed in my hands, the document Vance had tried to use to steal my grandmother's legacy. "You really think this is about a fabricated spreadsheet, Vance?" I asked softly. I gripped the heavy parchment paper with both hands. Right in front of his arrogant face, right in front of my deeply delusional parents, I ripped the legal document straight down the middle. The sharp sound of tearing paper echoed loudly through the dining room like a violent slap. I tore the deed again and again until it was nothing but a handful of shredded confetti. I opened my hands and let the pieces fall directly onto my dinner plate, right into the cold, congealing gravy. "What are you doing?" Vance shouted, his voice cracking with sudden, explosive panic. "You are destroying official legal documents." "I am taking out the trash, Vance," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I turned my attention to Attorney Harrison, who had extracted one final, single sheet of legal paper from his leather folder. I took the document from him and slid it directly across the polished mahogany table toward Vance. It glided smoothly and stopped perfectly next to his wineglass. "Read it," I commanded. Vance stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake. His hands were visibly shaking as he slowly reached out and picked it up. His eyes darted across the bold text at the top of the page. He opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. His lips moved silently as he tried to process the impossible, terrifying legal reality staring him right in the face. "Read the title of the document out loud, Vance," I insisted, my voice echoing with unyielding, absolute authority. Let my parents hear exactly what kind of paperwork we are dealing with tonight. Vance swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing erratically. Notice of debt assignment, Vance read, his voice reduced to a hollow, terrified whisper. My father leaned forward heavily, his brow furrowed in deep, sudden confusion. What does that mean? What is a debt assignment? I turned to my father, a cold smile finally reaching my eyes. It means, Father, that when my company's AI identified Vance's highly distressed toxic real estate portfolio, I didn't just look at it. I paused, letting the sheer magnitude of the situation fully sink into their arrogant minds. My acquiring institution bought it. My acquiring institution bought it, I repeated, letting the words settle over the dining room like a thick layer of suffocating ash. We bought the entire distressed debt portfolio. The silence following my statement was so absolute, so profoundly heavy, that the only sound in the entire house was the soft, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. Vance was completely frozen, staring at the notice of debt assignment as if the crisp legal paper might spontaneously combust and burn his eyes out. He didn't speak. He barely seemed to be breathing. I didn't give him or my parents a single second to recover. I stepped closer to the table, dominating the physical space. When my global conglomerate finalized the massive acquisition of my logistics platform, we utilized my AI to scan the market for heavily discounted, high-risk commercial assets, I explained, my voice ringing with a surgical, unyielding precision. My algorithm flagged a specific cluster of commercial holding companies that were 99.8% likely to default within the fiscal quarter. They were toxic. They were bleeding capital, and the primary institutional lenders were desperately trying to offload them for pennies on the dollar before the entire structure collapsed. Cressida's breathing became shallow and rapid. She looked at her husband, her perfectly manicured hands trembling. Vance? What holding companies? Sterling Commercial Real Estate, Cressida, I answered for him, and all of its subsidiary LLCs. The conglomerate purchased the entire debt block at a massive discount, and because my software was the exact tool that identified the acquisition, I successfully negotiated a very specific, non-negotiable stipulation into my final buyout contract. I paused, looking down at Vance, watching his broad shoulders physically cave in. I retain sole personal voting rights and executive advisory control over that specific block of distressed debt, which means, Vance, that those massive anonymous institutional lenders you have been aggressively bragging about all night, the ones you claim to play golf with? I leaned forward slightly, making sure he saw nothing but absolute freezing execution in my eyes. They don't exist anymore. I am your sole commercial creditor. I own your debt. I own your holding company. And by extension, I own your entire professional existence. My mother let out a small, horrified gasp, pressing both hands over her mouth. The golden son-in-law, the man she was willing to sacrifice her own daughter to protect, was entirely at the mercy of the woman they had spent the last 2 hours viciously abusing. Vance looked up at me. His dark eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. The elite, polished real estate mogul act was completely gone. He looked like a cornered rat. You planned this, Vance whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. A drop of sweat fell from his chin onto his silk tie. You knew my properties were failing, and you specifically bought the debt just to completely destroy me. I did not make you leverage your company into oblivion, Vance, I replied coldly. I did not force you to lie to your investors, falsify your occupancy rates, or attempt to steal my grandmother's inheritance tonight to cover your massive fraudulent failures. You dug your own grave. I simply bought the shovel. But the extension, Vance choked out, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles were white. The commercial underwriters submitted a formal request for a 30-day loan extension to your holding company on Wednesday afternoon. We offered higher interest yields. We offered secondary collateral. We just need a temporary grace period to avoid triggering a total corporate collapse before the holidays. I am fully aware of your desperate extension request, Vance, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room. And as the sole voting authority on that specific debt block, I have the absolute final say on whether or not Sterling Commercial Real Estate actually gets that lifeline. I let the heavy silence stretch for a moment, ensuring he felt the full, crushing weight of my next words. "And I am officially denying your request." The tiny bit of color that had remained in his face vanished entirely. "No," Vance whimpered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched plea. "No, Zinnia, you can't do that. You will destroy the entire firm. My investors will be entirely wiped out. I will be ruined. You can't possibly be that vindictive." "I am not being vindictive, Vance," I replied, my tone perfectly measured. "My AI algorithm assessed your portfolio and determined it has a 0% chance of recovery. I am simply executing a highly calculated, asymmetrical risk curve based on tangible data. Isn't that the exact phrase you used to defend yourself earlier tonight? I am just repositioning my assets." I turned to Attorney Harrison, who was standing like a silent, formidable sentinel. "Tomorrow morning is Black Friday," I continued, looking back at Vance. "At exactly 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the financial markets will officially open for the abbreviated holiday trading session, and the very first automated legal action my conglomerate will execute is the total, unyielding denial of your extension. Sterling Commercial Real Estate will be immediately pushed into mandatory federal default." Vance squeezed his eyes shut, a single pathetic tear leaking out and rolling down his cheek. "The major banks will seize your office, freeze your accounts, and lock down every single empty property tied to your firm," I stated, spelling out the exact brutal consequences without a single ounce of pity. "But the financial ruin is only the beginning of your problems, Vance. When the federal regulators initiate the liquidation process, they will conduct a mandatory forensic audit of your corporate ledgers. And my software already identified massive, glaring discrepancies in how you reported your occupancy rates and your collateral to your primary investors. You didn't just make a bad market prediction. You actively falsified commercial documents to hide your massive losses. You committed federal wire fraud." Cressida let out a loud, hysterical sob. She stumbled backward, bumping into the antique china cabinet. "Wire fraud!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the house. "You are sending my husband to federal prison?" "By tomorrow afternoon, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the SEC will be walking into your pristine downtown office with a stack of warrants," I told her calmly. "They will confiscate his computers, his private servers, and his encrypted phone. All of those luxury cars, the custom suits, the $50,000 watches. They were all purchased with stolen, fraudulent money. Tomorrow, the entire commercial real estate sector will know exactly what he is. He will be universally blacklisted, and he will likely spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary." Attorney Harrison cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the frantic, hyperventilating room. "As your legal counsel, Zinnia, I must advise you that we have already forwarded the preliminary algorithmic audit reports to the Securities and Exchange Commission," Attorney Harrison stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "The federal authorities are fully aware of the situation regarding Mr. Sterling's firm. The liquidation and the subsequent criminal investigation are now entirely unavoidable legal realities." As those final, damning words left the attorney's mouth, a terrifying new realization swept through the quiet room. My mother, Althea, suddenly let out a sharp, ragged gasp, sounding exactly like a woman who was physically choking on the stale indoor air. Her knees buckled violently, and she collapsed heavily into the nearest dining chair. Her hands flew to her throat, her chest heaving in rapid, shallow bursts. She was violently hyperventilating, her eyes wide with a blinding, primal panic that had absolutely nothing to do with Vance going to federal prison. My father was not faring any better. The tall, imposing patriarch who had spent 30 years dictating the lives of everyone around him had suddenly turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray. He reached out and gripped the back of his leather chair, swaying on his feet as if he had just been struck by a physical blow. He stared directly at Vance, his mouth opening and closing in absolute shock. "Vance!" my father whispered, his voice cracking with a raw, terrifying desperation. "What about the bridge capital? What about the primary liquid injection?" Vance didn't answer. He just kept his eyes squeezed shut and lowered his heavy head into his hands, effectively confirming my father's absolute worst nightmare. I looked between my hyperventilating mother and my paralyzed father. A sickening realization began to form in my mind, a piece of the puzzle that was so deeply, monumentally stupid, I hadn't even factored it into my algorithmic models. "What bridge capital, Father?" I asked, keeping my tone sharply focused. "You just read me a newly drafted trust document pledging the estate. You said you were going to leverage this house to help him secure a new construction loan for the plaza. My father slowly turned his head to look at me. The arrogant, authoritarian facade was entirely gone, completely shattered, replaced by the hollow, empty stare of a man standing on the absolute edge of a sheer cliff. "We lied," my father choked out, a single tear escaping his eye and tracing a path down his weathered cheek. "The trust document reading tonight, it was just a theatrical performance. It was a desperate attempt to intimidate you, to force you into handing over your grandmother's warehouse so we could buy Vance a few more days." My mother let out a loud, agonizing wail. She rocked back and forth in her chair, clutching her pearl necklace so tightly the string looked ready to snap. "We already gave him the house, Zinnia," my mother sobbed, her voice breaking into a hysterical, ugly screech. 6 months ago, Vance came to us in secret. He said the commercial market was fluctuating and he just needed a temporary cash injection to secure a massive return on a downtown property. He promised us it was an absolute guarantee. He swore on his own life that it was a flawless investment. And she pointed a shaking, manicured finger at Vance, who was still hiding his face in his hands, refusing to look at the people he had completely destroyed. "We went behind your back," my mother confessed, the absolute horror of her actions finally crushing her. "We quietly remortgaged this entire estate. We took out a $4 million cash loan against the fully paid off equity of the Bramwell family home. And we wired every single penny directly into Sterling Commercial Real Estate's primary operating fund. We gave him everything we had." I stood there, completely stunned by the sheer, breathtaking magnitude of their financial stupidity. "You mortgaged your primary residence?" I stated, the absolute absurdity of the situation echoing loudly in the room. "You took out a $4 million loan at 65 years old to fund a failing real estate developer who was actively drowning in toxic debt." They had denied me a $10,000 loan to launch a legitimate revolutionary software company because I was supposedly a bad investment. They had ruthlessly mocked my work ethic, forced me to live in a freezing basement, and treated me like a humiliating financial burden. Yet, they had blindly handed over $4 million in hard cash to a smooth-talking con artist simply because he wore an expensive Italian suit and drove a leased luxury car. They had willingly gambled away their entire generational wealth on a complete illusion. And now Vance is facing mandatory federal default tomorrow morning, I reminded them, spelling out the exact brutal consequences of their secret, catastrophic gamble. When the regulators freeze his assets and liquidate his holding companies at 8 a.m., your $4 million will be entirely swallowed up by his primary institutional creditors. You are unsecured private investors. You will be at the absolute bottom of the payout list. You will not see a single dime of that money ever again. My father let out a low, guttural groan and buried his face in his hands. His legs finally gave out, and the proud patriarch crumpled heavily onto the thick Persian rug. "And because you are both retired and cannot possibly afford the massive monthly payments on a new $4 million commercial mortgage without Vance's promised returns," I continued, my voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "The bank will inevitably foreclose on this house. They will seize this sprawling estate. You will be completely, legally evicted." The $5 million trust fund they had so proudly used to threaten me, to demand my complete submission earlier tonight, was a complete and total fabrication. It didn't exist anymore. They had already thrown it into a raging fire 6 months ago. My parents were not just losing their precious golden son-in-law to federal prison. They were losing their home, their country club status, their elite social circle, and their entire prestigious identity. They had absolutely nothing left. The psychological whiplash in the room was almost physically nauseating to witness. The absolute realization that their manufactured kingdom was burning to the ground triggered a sudden, grotesque, and entirely predictable transformation. My mother, Althea, who had literally just called me an embarrassing failure and a selfish disappointment, suddenly scrambled out of her dining chair. She practically shoved Vance out of the way as she rushed toward me, her arms outstretched wide, her face streaked with ruined makeup. "Oh, my sweet girl," my mother cried out, her voice taking on a sickeningly desperate maternal pitch. "My brilliant, successful Zinnia, I knew it. I always knew you were destined for absolute greatness." She lunged forward, attempting to wrap her arms around my shoulders in a forceful, suffocating embrace. I took a swift, deliberate step backward, leaving her grasping at empty air. She stumbled slightly, her expensive pearls swinging wildly against her chest. I held my hand up flat, stopping her from taking another step toward me. "Do not touch me," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing temperature. "Do not dare pretend you are proud of me now just because my bank account has more zeros than yours." "But Zinnia," my mother sobbed, clasping her hands together in front of her chest as if she were praying to a newly discovered deity. "You are my child, my own flesh and blood. You have to understand that everything we did tonight was just tough love. We were pushing you because we wanted to see you thrive. And look at you now. You are a corporate titan. You are a multi-millionaire." She dropped to her knees right in front of me, her designer dress pooling on the floor. "We are your family, Zinnia," she begged hysterically. "You cannot just abandon your own parents on Thanksgiving. We will completely change. We will treat you with the ultimate respect you deserve. You will be the absolute head of this family. Just please. Please do not let the bank throw us out into the snow. You have $180 million in cash. You can fix this entire horrific misunderstanding with a single phone call. You can pay off the $4 million mortgage and save your childhood home." My father looked up at me from the floor, his face entirely stripped of its arrogant dignity. His eyes were red and streaming with tears. It was a pathetic, humiliating sight. "Zinnia, please," my father begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whimper. "I am begging you. I have never begged for anything in my entire life, but I am begging my youngest daughter right now. Forgive Vance's debt. Call your corporate board and tell them to give Sterling Commercial Real Estate the extension. If you let them liquidate him tomorrow, we lose the house. We lose the cars. We lose our entire retirement. We will be out on the street. You can erase this entire nightmare. We gave you life, Zinnia. We fed you and sheltered you. You owe us this one final act of mercy." Cressida crawled off the antique chair and stumbled across the dining room. Her perfect blonde blowout was completely ruined, black mascara streaking down her pale cheeks. She grabbed the edge of the mahogany table for support, looking at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Zinnia, I am so incredibly sorry," Cressida wailed, her voice echoing shrilly off the crystal chandeliers. "I was just jealous. I was always deeply jealous of how smart you were. You are the best sister in the entire world. Please do not let the federal agents take my husband away. Please do not let them take our money. I will do anything you want. I will quit my job and work for you. I will be your personal assistant. Just please give Vance the extension." I stood there looking down at the three of them. They were groveling at my feet, openly weeping and offering up the most hollow, desperate apologies I had ever heard in my entire life. The sheer magnitude of their hypocrisy was breathtaking. Less than 20 minutes ago, they were aggressively conspiring to steal a $400,000 property from me simply to appease the very man who had secretly bankrupted them. They had tried to force me into complete submission just to assert their dominance. They had threatened to actively destroy my professional career using corporate connections that didn't even exist. And now, because the financial tables had completely, violently turned, they expected me to instantly forgive decades of severe emotional abuse. They expected me to reach into my newly acquired wealth and eagerly hand over millions of dollars to rescue them from the direct consequences of their own toxic, arrogant greed. "You didn't use tough love, Mother," I said, addressing the frantic woman kneeling on the floor. "You used me as a financial punching bag because it made you feel superior." I turned my attention to my father, who was staring at my designer shoes in absolute defeat. "And you, Father? You didn't give Vance $4 million because you believed in supporting family. You gave it to him because you were completely blinded by his fake prestige. You wanted a piece of his fictional commercial legacy so badly that you secretly gambled away the very house we are standing in." I looked at my older sister, who was practically hyperventilating against the table. "And you don't want to be my assistant, Cressida. You just want me to write a massive check so you don't have to cancel your luxury country club memberships and admit to your wealthy friends that your husband is a common federal criminal." "You are all exactly the same," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute unyielding finality. "You don't care about me. You don't care about family loyalty. You only care about the money. And for the first time in my entire life, I am the one holding all of it." "Zinnia, please," my mother screamed, reaching out to grab the hem of my cashmere sweater. I stepped back again, my eyes burning with a cold fire. "You don't love me," I said, looking directly into my mother's tear-streaked face. "You love the $180 million I just made. If I had walked in here tonight and told you my software company had gone completely bankrupt, you would have laughed in my face. You would have used my failure as the perfect excuse to finally kick me out of the family forever. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending you suddenly discovered a deep maternal bond. You are just terrified of being poor." I walked over to the dining table. I reached past Vance's frozen, broken form and picked up the gravy-stained invoice for the luxury Mediterranean yacht charter. I wiped the paper off carefully with a clean linen napkin, walked over to Cressida, and dropped it right into her trembling lap. She flinched as if the piece of paper were on fire. "You should probably start packing for Italy, Cressida," I said, offering her a cold, empty smile. "You and Vance have a luxury vacation coming up next July. You already booked the private yacht and the vintage champagne. You should definitely go and enjoy the Amalfi Coast. It will be a wonderful distraction while the federal investigators are busy seizing your bank accounts and auctioning off your luxury cars. Just make sure you take a lot of pictures, because it is the absolute last luxury vacation you will ever take in your entire life." Attorney Harrison snapped his heavy leather briefcase shut. The sharp click echoed like a final gavel strike in the ruined dining room. "We are finished here, Zinnia," Attorney Harrison said respectfully, stepping back toward the hallway to give me space. "The legal notices have been formally served. The liquidation protocol will initiate precisely at 8 a.m. "Thank you, Attorney Harrison," I replied. I turned my back on my family. I didn't wait for another desperate apology. I didn't want to hear another pathetic excuse. I walked out of the dining room, the heels of my shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, and stepped into the grand foyer. My custom-tailored winter coat was hanging in the closet. I slipped it on, feeling the heavy, comforting warmth of the expensive fabric wrap around my shoulders. I buttoned it slowly, taking my time, savoring the absolute, intoxicating freedom of the moment. Behind me, I could hear the muffled sounds of my family completely falling apart. My mother was weeping hysterically, screaming at my father for secretly remortgaging the house without consulting a financial advisor. Cressida was screaming at Vance, hitting his chest and demanding to know how he could have been so incredibly stupid to lose everything. The perfect unified front they had displayed just an hour ago had completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. They were turning on each other like starved animals. I opened the heavy oak front door and stepped out into the freezing Boston night. The crisp, clean winter air filled my lungs, and a light snow had begun to fall, blanketing the manicured lawn in pristine white. It was incredibly quiet outside, a stark, beautiful contrast to the toxic chaos I was leaving behind. A sleek, black Maybach was idling quietly at the end of the long driveway. My private chauffeur was standing by the rear passenger door, waiting patiently in the cold. As I walked down the stone path, the motion sensor security lights illuminated the brand new, leased luxury SUV parked arrogantly by the front steps. I looked at Vance's vehicle, knowing it would be impounded by federal agents before the end of the weekend. My chauffeur opened the heavy car door for me. "Good evening, Miss Bramwell," he said politely. "Good evening," I replied, sliding into the plush, heated leather seat. As the Maybach pulled out of the driveway, its tires crunching softly against the fresh snow, I looked back at the sprawling brick colonial house one last time. It had always felt like a massive prison of expectations and emotional coldness. Now it just looked like a rapidly sinking ship. The golden child, the arrogant brother-in-law, and the narcissistic parents were all trapped inside, drowning in the exact inescapable debt they had actively tried to force onto me. I leaned back against the plush headrest, feeling the cool platinum of my watch against my wrist, and closed my eyes. I felt a profound sense of absolute, unbreakable peace. I had walked into that house as the family scapegoat, but I was driving away as the architect of my own destiny. 3 months later, February 2026, the winter sun was rising over the jagged, icy skyline of Manhattan, casting a brilliant, blinding golden light across the frozen city. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new corner office on the 65th floor of a sleek, glass-paneled high-rise in the financial district. I held a warm cup of artisan pour-over coffee in my hands, feeling the soothing heat seep into my palms as I watched the tiny yellow taxicabs navigating the snowy streets far below. The office was entirely mine. It was minimalist, elegantly designed, and breathtakingly quiet. There was no one here to yell at me, no one to belittle my ambitions, no one to demand my submission. I took a slow sip of my coffee, walked over to my massive oak desk, and opened my laptop. My inbox was meticulously organized, filled with updates from the board of directors, quarterly projections from the logistics AI I had built, and various philanthropic foundation requests. But there was one specific email resting at the very top of the list, flagged with high importance. It was a comprehensive legal brief from Attorney Harrison detailing the final, catastrophic fallout of the Thanksgiving massacre. I clicked it open, leaning back in my plush leather chair as my eyes scanned the stark, undeniable facts of my family's self-inflicted destruction. Just as I had promised, at exactly 8 a.m. on Black Friday, my holding company had officially denied the debt extension for Sterling Commercial Real Estate. The automated federal default was triggered in milliseconds. By 8:15 a.m., while most of the country was busy shopping for holiday electronics, a convoy of black SUVs had aggressively pulled up to Vance's prestigious downtown Boston office building. Over a dozen federal agents from the FBI and the SEC poured into the lobby. They didn't even bother asking the receptionist for an appointment. They physically kicked the glass doors to Vance's executive suite open, armed with a mountain of federal warrants. According to the reports, Vance had been sitting at his desk, desperately calling offshore accounts trying to move whatever liquid cash he had left. The agents confiscated his encrypted phone right out of his hands. They seized his servers, froze every single corporate and personal bank account tied to his name, and handcuffed him right in front of his terrified, unpaid staff. The forensic audit took less than 48 hours to completely unearth his massive, sprawling web of lies. Vance hadn't just exaggerated his occupancy rates. He had completely fabricated leases, invented shell companies to artificially inflate his property values, and actively forged commercial documents to secure tens of millions in fraudulent loans. He was indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and corporate extortion. Because the federal prosecutor deemed him a massive flight risk with hidden offshore liabilities, the judge outright denied bail. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy who had worn $50,000 watches and belittled me for living in a tiny apartment was currently sitting in a freezing federal holding cell, wearing a standard issue orange jumpsuit. His legal team had already informed him that with the sheer volume of undeniable digital evidence my AI had handed to the FBI, he was facing a mandatory minimum of 15 to 20 years in federal prison. But Vance's absolute ruin was only the epicenter of the blast. The shockwave had instantly obliterated my parents' manufactured kingdom. When the bank regulators officially froze Vance's holding company, the $4 million cash injection my parents had secretly wired to him was instantly swallowed by his secured institutional creditors. It was gone, evaporated into thin air. Because Roscoe and Althea Bramwell had no incoming revenue to service a massive $4 million commercial mortgage, the bank moved with ruthless, unyielding efficiency. The foreclosure notices were posted on the front gates of the sprawling colonial estate just 2 weeks after Thanksgiving. By mid-January, they were officially evicted. I scrolled down through Harrison's report, looking at the sterile public records. My father, the proud patriarch who had threatened to disinherit me from a $5 million trust fund that didn't even exist, was forced to declare complete personal bankruptcy. To cover their immediate, suffocating legal fees, my mother had to endure the ultimate, agonizing humiliation. A public auction. They sold the vintage china she had polished so obsessively. They sold the antique grandfather clock that had ticked in our hallway for decades. They even sold my mother's precious diamond tennis bracelets and pearl necklaces. Today, the people who had actively tried to steal my grandmother's $400,000 warehouse to save their prestige were living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a noisy, working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. My mother could no longer show her face at the elite country club. Her wealthy friends, the ones she had spent her entire life trying to impress, had completely abandoned her the moment the FBI raided her son-in-law's office. She was a social pariah, spending her days sitting in a cheap, poorly heated living room, drowning in the bitter reality of her own choices. My father was a broken, silent ghost of a man. The authoritarian boom in his voice was permanently gone. He had recently taken a part-time job as a greeter at a local hardware store just to afford their basic groceries and utilities. But the most poetic, devastating justice of all belonged to my older sister. Cressida had always thought she was the smartest person in the room. The Monday after Thanksgiving, recognizing that the ship was violently sinking, she had immediately driven to a high-powered divorce attorney. She filed for an emergency dissolution of marriage, desperately trying to legally sever herself from Vance's radioactive criminal empire before the federal agents could seize her personal assets. She planned to play the victim, claiming she was just a naive wife who had no idea what her monstrous husband was doing. She thought she could keep her high-paying job as a luxury art broker, keep her designer wardrobe, and simply wash her hands of the entire mess. But she severely underestimated the sheer sociopathic depths of the man she had married. During the federal discovery phase, the SEC auditors uncovered a stack of highly classified mezzanine loan contracts hidden in Vance's private safe. To secure the highest possible leverage from the shadow banks, Vance needed a co-signer to guarantee the debt. Without telling her, Vance had forged Cressida's signature on over a dozen personal guarantees. By legally tying her name to the toxic commercial loans, Vance had entirely pierced the corporate veil. Cressida wasn't just his wife. In the eyes of the federal government and the aggressive corporate creditors, she was a legally liable co-signer for millions of dollars in defaulted debt. The moment the scandal hit the local Boston news, the elite boutique art brokerage firm where Cressida worked immediately terminated her employment. They served high net worth billionaires. They could not afford to have a vice president whose face was plastered across the financial tabloids in a massive federal fraud investigation. She lost her job. She lost her luxury leased SUV. The creditors aggressively seized her personal bank accounts, forcing her to sell every designer dress, every emerald ring, and every pair of expensive shoes she had ever bought just to keep the lawyers from throwing her in jail alongside her husband. Like our parents, the golden child was forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The report noted her current employment status. To meet the basic requirements of her bankruptcy restructuring and to afford the rent on a tiny, dilapidated studio apartment, Cressida had been forced to take the only job that would hire her with a massive federal fraud investigation hanging over her background check. The woman who used to sneer at me for living in the garment district, the woman who had happily tried to force me into a humiliating entry-level data job on Thanksgiving, was now working a minimum wage shift as a cashier at a local discount supermarket. She spent 8 hours a day standing on her feet, scanning barcodes and bagging groceries for the exact same working-class people she had spent her entire life viciously looking down upon. I finished reading the report. The room was perfectly silent, save for the soft hum of the central heating. I didn't feel a single ounce of guilt. I didn't feel the urge to pick up my phone, call them, and offer them a lifeline. For 33 years, I had internalized their cruelty, believing that my worth was somehow tied to their approval. I had allowed them to make me feel small, inadequate, and selfish. But looking at the undeniable facts laid out before me, I finally understood the absolute truth. I didn't destroy my family. I merely handed them the exact mirror they had been desperately trying to avoid looking into for decades. They built their own cages out of greed, arrogance, and a blinding obsession with status. I was simply the one who finally locked the door and walked away with the key. I closed the laptop, the soft click echoing in the massive glass office. I picked up my coffee and walked back over to the window. The morning sun was fully up now, melting the thin layer of ice on the skyscrapers, making the entire city gleam like a boundless, shimmering ocean of endless possibility. I looked down at the custom platinum watch on my left wrist. It was ticking forward in smooth, continuous, beautiful motions. I had walked into the fire of their toxicity, and instead of letting it burn me to ash, I had used it to forge an empire. The Bramwell legacy they had fought so viciously to protect was completely dead and buried in the cold Boston ground. But my legacy, the one built on quiet resilience, undeniable brilliance, and unyielding self-respect, was just beginning. I smiled, took a deep breath of the quiet air, and got to work. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to protect your own peace, or if you've ever had to build your own empire while the people around you doubted your worth, let me know in the comments below. Your worth is never determined by those who refuse to see it. Please don't forget to hit the like button and hit subscribe to the channel for more stories of resilience, boundaries, and the ultimate satisfying revenge. Stay strong, protect your peace, and keep building your own beautiful empire.